Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to today's DevOps.com webinar, brought to you by TechStrong and Menlo Security. My name is Cody J. Brown. I'm the host of TechStrong Learning. Before we get to our presentation today, we do have a couple housekeeping notes to touch on. First, today's session is being recorded, so if you miss any of our discussion or you just like to share it with a friend, the on-demand recording will be made available shortly after this webinar concludes. If you have any questions for our speakers today, we want you to direct those to the Q&A tab, which can be found on the right side of your screen. And if you have any comments to further our conversation, or you just want to let us know from where you're tuning in, we want you to use the chat tab for those. There are a few handouts, which can also be found on the right side of your screen. 3 of them are links to some helpful websites to further today's discussion. And there is a downloadable PDF of the pulse meter, which is going to be the main topic of today's conversation. So highly recommend you download that. And finally, at the conclusion of today's webinar, we will have a drawing for 4 $25 Amazon gift cards, so stick around. So on to the topic of our panel today. We'll be covering secure application access for all your users. And I'm joined today by Eric Schwake, Senior Manager of Cybersecurity Strategy at Menlo, Dan Kirsch, Managing Director and Co-founder of TechStrong Research, and Mitch Ashley, Principal at TechStrong Research. And it is my pleasure at this point in time to turn the program over to Mitch to kick us off.
Well, thank you very much, Cody. I would just welcome everybody in our chat. And we love interacting with the audience. I'd say audience because you're really participating in this with us. So feel free to join us, join in, ask questions, comment on what we're talking about. And the good news is we won't be dragging you through any slides. We're going to be showing some data that we took with a unique approach that we have, something called the pulse meter. Before I do that, let me ask my other 2 panelists to introduce themselves. By the way, I am CTO of TechStrong Group and also principal with TechStrong Research, working with my colleague, Dan. Dan, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Dan Kirsch. I'm an industry analyst and along with Mitch, co-founded TechStrong Research.
Excellent. And Eric, our good friend Eric, how you doing? Introduce yourself, please.
Thanks, Mitch. Hi, everybody. This is Eric Schwake. I'm here at Menlo Security. I'm a senior manager of cybersecurity strategy, so I sort of cover the gamut of our security portfolio here at Menlo.
It's great having you both. We can talk kind of strategy level and, of course, technical stuff that we want to get into. So, Dan, would you describe a little bit before us? We have this thing called a pulse meter. And that's what we're going to be discussing, some of the data from that. And by the way, this pulse meter, I'll be showing it to you in just a moment. Something you can download in the handouts, or it'll be attached on a follow-up email, so you'll have access to this. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, absolutely. So during the first 2 weeks of February, we ran a number of flash polls across our TechStrong Group's audience. So that includes people in DevOps, people in security, digital CXO leaders. And we really wanted to understand the evolving feelings on access to private applications remotely. Obviously, the workplace has changed since COVID, and work from anywhere has cemented as sort of the normal thing. And so getting access to business critical applications is important. So we ran a number of polls. Across all the polls, we got more than 725 responses, which we were excited about. And I think there's a lot of interest about securely accessing private applications from wherever you are.
Excellent. Well, let's do this. I'm going to bring up the pulse meter. Again, folks can download this now or later. We'll be providing that to you and show you a little bit of some of the data that we're going to be talking about and cover our first question here. So I'm just sharing my screen. You can see the pulse meter coming up online. Let's jump down to this first question. How many corporate applications, not productivity like Office 365 or Gmail, et cetera, but things like Jira and Confluence and internal developed apps, business applications, do you need to access for your job? So a range of responses here between the different numbers here. Clearly it looks like most people are talking a handful of applications, 57% between 0 and 5. Hopefully it's not 0. 6 to 10, 23%. So there you're, really 3/4 of the folks right there, but you do have some people on the upper end of this with 11%. Dan, what are your reactions to this?
Yeah, so you have that group who are only accessing a small handful of private applications, and that's to be expected. As you mentioned, Mitch, we're not talking about run-of-the-mill business SaaS applications, but we're talking about private applications, DevOps apps. But my takeaway was, 2 out of 5 respondents need to access 6 or more applications. And although 11% isn't a eye-popping number, if you sort of think about it and say, 11% of the respondents said they need to access 20 or more applications. That's a ton of different applications. And then think about, IT managers and security teams managing the security and access around 20 plus applications. And that's just one person needs to access those 20 applications. Enterprise scale, we're talking about a tremendous number of applications.
Yeah, I'll add in. I mean, the numbers were interesting to me as well. I mean, obviously, I think, depending on organizational size and what you actually are, the sort of complexity of your organization, I think that sort of is indicative of how many applications you might have had that are internal private applications that you need to access. But as Dan mentioned, when you think about it from a CISO perspective or someone at that level, they look at this and they say, okay, there's all these applications. Who's using these applications? What are the security issues with each of these applications that I've got to manage for? It becomes a real big challenge. And a lot of times you talk to CISOs and the initial struggle around this is just wrapping their arms around this problem, because it could be there's a group of 5 folks in an organization that uses one application, and that's the only people who use it. But still, you've still got to understand, that application probably has linkages to other applications or data within the organization. So there's all these different, intertwined things with these private applications or in the internal applications that CISO or the CIO needs to really be thinking about more very broadly to sort of, how am I going to make this secure? How am I going to make this, accessible? And that's another big challenge, right? The accessibility of these applications when folks might not be connecting, they're not connected to a hardwired network connection from their office desk. They're at a Starbucks or their house or whatever doing the work these days. So how do you make sure that they get that access they need to get these applications and do their jobs throughout the day? But interesting numbers on how, like you said, only 11% were at 20 plus, but that's a lot of applications if you think about, what these folks are accessing to do their jobs. So.
Those are only people with 2 or more screens, by the way. So how do you get 20 apps open all at once?
Sure.
I don't know if you're using all of them at once. I think I fall into that, certainly that group of people.
Yeah.
And you said, Dan, how many responses did we get to our flash polls?
A total of more than 725.
Okay, so good sampling of responses from this. So, I think you guys covered some really good insights on that. Let's talk a little bit about how people are getting to these applications. Now, it's not new knowledge to any of us. What was remote work is a lot different than remote work of 2 or 3 years ago, right? Pre-COVID. What are some of the implications that you've seen? And I'll bring up some of the data here too, with now when we think about remote workers, which at one point was everybody, but may still be a large percentage of our workforce.
Yeah, and I'll start, and then I can maybe give over to Dan there for his insights. But one of the things when you think about these private applications, and again, we're not talking O365, G Suite, those sorts of things that are definitely browser based applications, but traditionally these internal applications were very application based. They had a widget you opened up to do to work within the application. But more and more organizations are looking at, how do we make this as easy to access as possible? So they're putting these applications up into the cloud, making them accessible via a browser. So there are stuff like SSH, RDP, those kinds of things that, there's still, a need to go into a distinct application to actually run with. But more and more, especially when we talk to organizations, even very large organizations, they're looking at ways, how can we put these applications up into a browser, make them accessible through a browser? Because their workers understand the browser. 75% of a worker's day is spent in a browser. So they understand, a worker intrinsically understands how to work in a browser. And so it's like, hey, why don't we put these applications in that browser to make it as easy to use as possible? And so we're seeing more organizations do that. And some of the research that we have here in this pulse meter really does show that. There are still a good proportion of applications that are, application based and you need a distinct application for, but more and more of these are moving into the browser. And I think if you think about your organization, the folks on this call today, if you think about your organization and how you're working with these applications, there's probably plans in place to move these into something that's accessible via a browser. And some of that, there's the marketing term digital transformation, right? That's been around for years now. And part of that is this, where it's, how can we digitally transform these applications and whatnot. And I think we're seeing more of that happen as we go forward here. And especially with this more hybrid workforce, I think it just becomes easier to have a browser that they can access their work applications from.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. One thing that you keep bringing up, Eric, is easy, which I think is a big part of it. So we all get that, the world has gone to remote, and even as people are trickling back into the office, it might be for part of the week. But even if you're going to the office every day, do you want to lug your laptop home every day? A lot of people are accessing these applications on the weekend. You're working at night. I mean, the whole idea of 9 to 5 doesn't really exist anymore. I mean, you might work 9 to 3 and then log back in from 10 o'clock to midnight or something. So, and people are accessing applications from iPads and their home computer. And so the idea that you're going to be able to put your corporate security on all these devices isn't realistic. And you certainly don't want agents and clients and applications on those devices. So I think that's also a big push for these browser-based app access. I mean, it just makes it easy. It allows the company to still control access, but it also removes all that friction and says to your workforce, access applications, whatever device you want for the most part, and the browser will sort of normalize the experience no matter what device you're on.
Yeah, I think there's two sides to the coin. There's an app for that. Yeah, there's an app, but there's always a browser for it too.
Exactly.
To get to it.
Yeah, and that's what I was trying to say. The browsers there's a familiarity with that, right? Folks know I do my Facebook in a browser, and I can also do this work that I've got to do in a browser. It's something they are in all the time, right? So it's not like they've got to figure out a different way to access something. It's just there. It's just easy button for them.
Oh, Eric, don't tell me you do Facebook. Friends don't let friends do
Facebook. No, I don't. I'm just
we'll have an intervention later after. All right. I'm going to pop up the data from the pulse meter. Eric, I'd love to have your reactions first. The 63% of people accessing corporate applications we're talking about through a browser.
Yeah, like I said, I think it's a great number. It's almost 2/3, right? Are accessing the applications through a browser. And again, this wasn't about O365 or G Suite. This was about these private applications, and much of that access is now through that browser. And I think that number will continue going up. As I've said, when we talk to our customers internally, there are plans in place, and it's not like this will happen in a week, right? I mean, because you have to sort of reconfigure things, rebuild some things, but there are plans in place to have this happen over the next 6, 12, 18 months, where these customers are that we've talked to are really looking at ways to try and get off of these clients that they've got to send out there for users to actually access the application.
Yeah, and I think some of it is also, a lot of these applications were never designed for remote access. I mean, they might have been designed for someone VPNing in or if they're on the road, but they weren't designed as sort of cloud or private cloud applications. So the browser is almost a little, I don't want to say trick, but a way of making these applications accessible without having to fully re-architect it, especially if it's an internally developed application. You don't have to fully redevelop it. You just have to make it browser friendly.
Yeah, it's interesting. Things that continue to evolve back and forth. At one point, sort of IE is required. Those days are long gone, and it's your browser of choice, including browsers that are privacy centric, as well as the commonly used and ones that are a little less. So I would imagine from a security standpoint, Eric, the number of variables that we're talking about, Dan mentioned iPads and tablets and phones. I mean, I saw a number earlier this week. I think it was in December, 54% of web traffic were coming from mobile devices. So, we were crossing this Rubicon from, laptops, computers to our mobile devices. And when we're talking about remote, most of the time, or a lot of time, most of those aren't managed by the corporation.
Exactly. Yeah, and that's a big thing that organizations are struggling with, is that they're trying to, again, make the work possible for their users, whoever those users are, but they might not always have control of that device. And that really scares, if there's security folks on this call, that probably really scares you, right? You don't have access to getting those agents down. You don't have access to deploying some AV. You don't have access to putting some firewall stuff in there. So you don't have these controls you're used to on a managed device to ensure there's at least a modicum of security, right? You're sort of just hoping that this user has some kind of, hygiene around that device while you give them this access. So it's a big thing for security teams to understand, okay, what are we going to do to really provide the security for all these unmanaged devices that are out there? How do we do that? And this sort of leads into the other question I think we want to discuss, Mitch, a little bit, is that organizations are more and more thinking about, how do we give access to contractors or third parties? Again, it's sort of that same idea, right? It's an unmanaged device, but it's a little even scarier when a third party or a contractor needs access, because that user themselves hasn't fully been vetted. They haven't gone through the full employment process, the background checks, all that, that stuff hasn't necessarily been done for that user. So you're not only on an unmanaged device, but the user is sort of unmanaged, right? And so you need to figure out, how are you going to provide security for that user themselves, in addition to their device. And so that's a big challenge that we're seeing a lot of customers dealing with. One of the customers that we talk to and we've been talking to is looking at that, and if you think it broadly, like about the insurance industry, for instance, you have the big insurance companies, and then you might have insurance adjusters who might not be direct employees. And of course, you have those insurance customers like us, right? And so if a claim happens, generally what they do is they say, well, they go to a web portal, it's a publicly accessible web portal. The adjuster goes in there, they upload documents, the claimant, I go in there and upload some documents, right? So you have all these sort of third parties going into the system, uploading all kinds of different stuff or whatever, viewing different stuff. And it's very, very hard for these organizations to provide security around that. So we're talking to customers around, what is a different way to do that. But Dan, I don't know if you want to talk about this as well, your experience.
Yeah, because it's also the problem is bigger than just providing access to, a contractor or a third party. I mean, think about when you're working with a big consulting group or an overseas development team or something like that. I mean, there's a lot of people that need access that you're never going to have a conversation with. I mean, it's someone two rungs down from your main point of contact, and so you've got to hope, number one, that they're trained correctly. Obviously, working with companies that understand security is important, but how can you safely share applications with those people that you never even really interact with, and how do you track them throughout a project and cut off access when it's time to cut it off? Whether sometimes things end poorly, but also if the project is just done, is there some sort of automated way or a workflow that you have in process to cut off access? I think is important, because a lot of times people just never really, they give access and then they just sort of leave it open because the project is done. You got 17 other things to worry about, and you don't sort of go back and look until someone else, maybe a few months later, if you're lucky, or maybe a couple of years later, says, gee, this application is open to a whole group of people who we haven't interacted with in a year. What's going on here?
It's a good point. And the devices they're using to access that is going to change. It's nothing static anymore, right? It's always constantly changing. I want to bring up the stat that you guys kind of referencing or talking to around percentage of organizations. Corporate applications are accessed by third parties and contractors, could be partners, could be all kinds of, different reasons why people are, utilizing these apps. Now, corporate apps, as you were talking before, Eric, it could be a Jira, Confluence, or whatever. Could also be your own internally developed app. So the wide range of possibilities here. I'm kind of struck by, it's fairly evenly distributed until you get to the 43% is greater than 15. Here we're into the land of an app for everything, many applications. That brings in that complexity you were talking about, Eric.
Yeah, for sure. And, if you think about it, obviously from the CISO's perspective, when they look at that 43% number that are accessing over 15% of the applications, it's scary to them because obviously the application access itself is important and is challenging how you establish that. But then applications tie to data, and that's what all the companies on this call have. The lifeblood of your organization is the data. And so figuring out how those applications that all these third parties are accessing and what data that they now have at their fingertips by, again, this unmanaged device, unmanaged user, and how do you make sure that stays secure? And that's, from a security standpoint, that is a tough nut to crack. And we're looking at, companies are looking at how to do that and different ways to do that. But it's, I'm sure it's one of those things that CISOs keeps them sort of up at night to figure out how to solve that problem.
Yeah, I think that brings up a good point also in terms of access to granular security controls. So you can, grant these third parties and contractors huge amounts of access, full access to all of your data and your application. But how can you allow access and role-based access to certain segments of data, maybe a test data set rather than customer data or specific IP. So I think we're seeing CISOs interested in not just ways of securely sharing applications and data, but ways of changing the controls and the levers to control what are able to access and view.
Sorry, I had to step away there for a minute. Someone was asking for access to one of our applications. So I'm curious. And Dan, you talk to a lot of companies, as an analyst, you talk to a lot of practitioners as well. Are people still kind of using the old tried and true methods when it comes to access control to applications as we shift to this landscape? Or are they looking for something? Do they have a new set of requirements or some evolving requirements that they're struggling to figure out what they need to do as a next step?
Yeah, old technology never dies. So, VPNs are still hugely used. So it's, the majority of companies still use VPNs. They might have been set up a decade ago. The Colonial pipeline hack was because of technical debt and an old VPN that wasn't patched and wasn't updated, and no one really paid attention. So, the problem with VPNs is, first of all, no one likes them. So Eric, early on, you were talking about making it easy for people. VPNs are the exact opposite. If you're, at the Starbucks, you got to make sure that your connection is stable and it's fast enough. And there's a good chance your VPN is going to break halfway through a Zoom meeting or whatever you're doing, in addition to active apps. So I think that there's a lot of issues with the old technology, but it's also there and people are using it because it's available. I also think VPN for huge, massive amounts of people working remotely. The whole idea of VPNs was you might have a sales leader or an executive or working on the weekend, and they needed secure access to corporate applications. Then people, we have this VPN, let's use it for massive, large scale remote working. And it just was never designed to solve that problem. And then the third thing we see is also VPNs allow tons of access. So as we were talking about in terms of giving too much access to data that's connected with applications. VPNs, for the most part, are you either have access or you don't have access. Look at those granular controls.
The over provisioning problem.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And I'll just dig into that more. I mean, obviously, VPNs are one of these things that's like you said, Dan, they were provisioned out for 10, maybe 20% of the workforce in the company. And then obviously COVID hit and it was like, oh no, we don't have the hardware to support this. There was a major challenge with providing that access. And so what we actually saw customers do in that initial, 6-month time frame is they looked at solutions to provide them this access, sort of these zero trust solutions to provide them this initial access. And so a lot of it was hair on fire decisions because they were just like, we need some way to get access to these applications like today. I mean, we have to do this. Our VPN's not working, whatever. And so they made these buying decisions based on that. There wasn't the general, long thought out process of a sort of an architectural change that would necessarily go into this. And so now after things have sort of simmered down a little bit and people are reestablishing and reevaluating their sort of strategy around work from home and the hybrid workforce, they're re-looking at those decisions, I think. And so we're seeing actually customers re-look at those decisions when they were thinking about what they wanted to do to the VPNs. But, as Dan mentioned, the other problem here is that security wise, these, it's just an all or nothing thing. It's very overly permissive when you have that VPN access. And when you think back to that number, that number of third parties that need access, generally you don't want to give them a VPN access because you don't want them to have full access to the network. And even for internal users, you don't necessarily want to have them access on the VPN either, because if my credentials get hacked, that attacker is now Eric Schwalke on Menlo Security's network, and who knows what can happen at that point, right? And so you have challenges there of how do we again provide this access that we need to the applications in more of a secure fashion. And so that's sort of where they're starting to rethink this and bringing in like the zero trust approaches and that sort of stuff.
Paul in the chat, thank you, Paul, for commenting, brings up a really good point. He was thinking that remote and hybrid, and one of the ways I interpret hybrid is I may do two days a week in the office and 3 at home, right? Sort of the sort of flow between different numbers of days will be a larger percentage of the work environment for folks going forward. I definitely agree with that. I think we're in this sort of fluid, flexible, yes, some things have to be in the office and maybe some companies will demand that. I'd prefer not to work for those companies, but that's another issue. The workforce, I think, is asking for this flexibility. And that means the COVID time, while as you said, Eric, we made some rapid decisions and then we had to go back and kind of shore things up as well. But we have to think about flexibility going forward, and because our workforce is going to demand it.
Right.
Cool. I'm curious too, we have some time. I'd love to step in and talk a little bit more about the Menlo Security Approach. This is obviously sponsored by Menlo, and thank you for your discipline, Eric, and not breaking out into slideware. We won't do that now. But obviously we're talking about this because it's relevant to what you all do, and I appreciate you sharing some of the challenges that customers are bringing to you about this. Tell us a little bit about your approach to solving this problem.
Yeah, one of the things actually, and I'll sort of step slowly into Menlo because I want to sort of take a step back and talk more broadly about sort of zero trust and zero trust network access, because I think there's still some confusion around that. I mean, it's one of these terms that's been bandied about, especially ZTNA for, maybe a couple of years now. I think I saw when I did the RSA right before COVID hit back in 2020 I think it was February or March, right before everything sort of shut down. Zero trust was, big topic, right? And there's still a lot of confusion around that. I think when we did the survey, we actually saw that in the survey. We didn't publish those in the results, but there's still, quite a bit of, uncertainty or people just not even understanding what ZTNA even was. And so when we think about ZTNA, which stands for Zero Trust Network Access, we're talking about a few different things that are sort of associated with that. The first aspect of ZTNA, when we talk about it, is really around that sort of continuous verification. And what that means is continuously verifying the users and the applications they're accessing at all times, regardless of the device they're on or the network they're on or anything like that. It's sort of this continuous verification process. The other big part of ZTNA that I sort of touched on with the VPN problem is that it really can help limit spread of attack, right? So if an attacker gets my credentials and all I have access to is 2 apps instead of the 10 that my company uses, the attack spread is dramatically limited because that attacker can maybe do some bad stuff in my 2 apps, but they can't go out through the rest of the network and cause all kinds of harm. And then the other big one on ZTNA is sort of this automatic monitoring and reporting capability and visibility and response to various attacks. And so when you think about sort of looking at a solution, a ZTNA solution to either replace or augment a VPN or establish connections with third-party contractors to applications or whatever else, ZTNA solutions are great. And I think you talk about it, and Mark's been talking about it for a while. But within each of your organizations, all you folks on this call, it's not just hey, we're just going to go buy Eric's Menlo solution and have it deployed tomorrow. It's definitely a process, and whether you have a CISO in the organization or someone else high up in the organization who's responsible for networking and security, it's a matter of first establishing, what is the challenge, right? And I mean, if you go back to the number of applications that might be used in your organization, it's a matter of auditing, understanding that corpus of applications, figuring out, okay, who really needs access to these applications, right? So there's this big auditing process that needs to take place. And then at the CISO level, it's really a justification because it's a complete re-architecture of what everybody's used to. Everybody's used to this VPN. And so now you're telling them, well, there's gonna be this new thing. And so it's a matter of that CISO or that security leader really tying into the other business units and displaying and speaking to the benefits, the ROI that will come from a ZTNA solution, right? Because it's not just about deploying it, it's about how is this actually going to benefit my company, right? From the CEO, how is this going to benefit if we deploy ZTNA? And so that's really, I think, a big part of it is sort of getting your hands around what ZTNA is, what sort of problems it solves for, and then taking that to the business, explaining it, and then working through the process of actually implementing a ZTNA solution. And I don't know, Dan, if you want to talk about Zero Trust, ZTNA any more than that, but.
Yeah, because I think part of it is about sort of pivoting the way you're approaching remote access. And so, Eric, you touched on it. Rather than the old approach, which is basically here are your credentials, you've got access to 20 applications, whether you need them or not. And instead, it's this different mindset of give as little access as possible. So what applications does Eric need? And if Eric requests access to a specific application, it has to be verified, and there needs to be a reason why you have access to that. It's not because Eric or whoever is a bad guy. It's because you got to take this approach that Eric's going to be hacked or Eric's colleague is going to be hacked, and the fewer applications they have access to, the better. And so it's sort of a need to know approach or a least possible access approach. And as you said, it starts with this whole understanding of your application landscape, which is a project unto itself. And so sometimes you might want to start with, here are 5 applications we want to start with, rather than, we're going to totally reimagine our entire corporate application access. Here are 5 applications that are really important. The data is important. Let's start with that, and then we'll take lessons learned and move forward with the next group of applications.
Right, and for sure, and that's so the sort of the 4 primary use cases for ZTNA solution or VPN replacement, third-party contractor access, which we've already talked about a lot. Mergers and acquisitions, of course, establishing connection between various applications, and then obviously this drive to multi-cloud, and by that I mean applications in different places, right? They're in headquarters or up in the public cloud or whatever. But with a VPN replacement specifically, of course, a lot of vendors that we would just say, just replace your VPN and put our ZTNA solution in there. But as Dan mentioned, I think it's more, at least initially, it's more the augmentation side of that. It's like, okay, what can you take? What is the idea around some, let's take a phased approach at this. We're not going to rip out this thing that we've got in there that's been working fine for 20 years. We're going to take a measured approach to this and sort of take it at chunks rather than just all at one kind of thing. And so I think the VPN And that's how whenever I talk about it, it's more of a VPN replacement and or augmentation. I don't just say, hey, I don't expect that you all are going to replace your VPNs tomorrow with a ZTNA solution. So
doesn't have to be rip and replace.
Yeah.
I'm curious, from the data that we shared from the pulse meter, a couple of times this issue of multiple applications and greater than 15, greater than 20. Why is that relevant? Why is that a concern? Why is so many people using so many large number of many applications? I don't know, cause for concern, but to increase the problem space over people who may be casual for 2 or 3 apps. You want to take that, Eric?
Well, I think what you see is that, and it could be an auditing process, right? It could be that you have users who have all these applications and there's duplication of effort across applications, right? I don't know if a user is actually using 20 or more applications. Do they all do completely different things, or can there be some way to sort of merge this a little bit? So I think that might be one of the great things that comes with all this, is that you can see that there's ways to sort of shrink that amount of applications. But as it is, if there are that many applications that you need access to, what's the best way to provide that securely and conveniently for a user? And so, is it just provide full access on a VPN and then they get access to everything that they might not need, or does it get a little more specific and provide a ZTNA solution to do that? I think it's a process that companies are trying to figure out how they work through.
Dan, Scott in the chat, thanks, Scott, for your comment, brings up a good point, kind of in a little bit of a colorful way, about governance and compliance and security sort of being overtaken by always what the business need or whatever the driver is. And I know compliance and governance are particular areas of your focus. It seems to me that, we might have stuff going through the VPN, and we have other things going through the browser, but what about all that stuff in the browser? And you need approaches that sort of self-track or report data that gives you some information to be able to not only just respond, but also meet the governance requirements, compliance requirements that ultimately security teams are going to have to do.
Yeah, it sounds silly, but I think a watershed moment was several years ago when executives, iPads and tablets became ubiquitous, and executives came in with their iPad and said, "Make it work. This is how I want to work at home." And security teams went a little crazy because they were used to being Mr. No, and sometimes they liked being Mr. No, and you can say that to some pretty senior people. But when the CEO and the CFO are coming in with their iPad and saying, "Make it work," the security group needs to make it work and securely work. So I think that was sort of the beginning of the security team needing to sort of work with executives and not just say no, and figure out ways of how can we maintain security and compliance and privacy with access to all of these different devices. So I think that was sort of the beginning of this more flexible approach to remote working, remote access, variety of bring your own devices, and the idea that not everyone is going to download some sort of agent onto every one of their devices so that your company can control it. You tell an employee they've got to bring their own iPhone to work, they're going to say, "I'm not downloading a access management tool from you where you can remotely wipe my the picture, my 7,000 pictures of my dog and my kids." No, if you want to buy me an iPad, that's fine, or an iPhone, but otherwise it's my device and I control how I use it. So I think that was sort of the beginning of this different mindset about security organizations.
Though I understand many cats out there want to wipe out those pictures of dogs. Sorry, Eric, you were going to comment.
No, I was just agreeing. The shift of exactly being able to access things in the manner that they want to access from the device they want to access it from it put this onus on the security teams of, oh crap, how are we going to really secure this? I mean, how are we going to do this? Because we've got a job to make sure this data doesn't leak inappropriately, and we don't get ransomware attacks or whatever else. And we have these new devices that we just can't get our hooks in, and so it's been a big struggle.
It's the irony. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Dan.
Yeah, no, I was just thinking. We've sort of zeroing in on this whole concept of ZTNA. So I think we've differentiated VPNs from ZTNA. But Eric, maybe you want to talk a little bit about CASBs, Cloud Access Security Brokers, and we're talking about ZTNA and not there's other technologies and that are tangential, but not the same type of solution.
Yeah, I mean, so obviously the major difference is that ZTNA type solutions are really meant for those private applications that you use that are managed by you, right, in some fashion or another. So think of Jira, Jenkins, Confluence, those things that you might have installed in your local data center, maybe you've installed an instance out in some public cloud somewhere, but you have sort of ultimate control of that application. Whereas CASBs are really more intended for the public applications like Google, G Suite, O365, and providing some security around that, and also doing some stuff around shadow IT. But again, the shadow IT stuff is again meant for applications that are on the web that are SaaS apps that are not managed by you, by the organization. And so there's a distinction of, you still probably need both, and you probably want both in the organization to provide different amounts of security, but the applications that they control for are a bit different.
Hey, Dan, Scott also asked if there was any difference in our pulse meter data, differentiating between support access and customer access. Is that something we looked at?
No, it's a good question. We didn't sort of go into that granular of a deep dive. We wanted to do get some quick data rather than so we didn't really get into the deeper use cases of why and how people are accessing that data in the applications. It's a good question.
Yeah.
Good. But before we wrap up, anything else, Eric, you want to share with us, particularly about the Menlo Approach? I know CASB too, you have stuff in that category. We could go another hour easily talking about all the things Menlo does.
Yeah, I'll quickly touch on sort of the approach that we take with ZTNA, right? And so when you think of ZTNA, like I said, it's been a phrase and a productized thing for a number of years now, a couple of years. So there's a lot of different vendors in the space. And we do some stuff very similar to what you'd expect, right? I mean, it's about providing this access in a secure fashion to users, regardless of the device or network they're on, and very granular access again. So only the applications they need access to at a specific point in time. One of the things that's a bit differentiated from us is that we really take a clientless first approach. And what I mean by that is if you look at the numbers on how many applications are accessible through a browser and through their own client, you see more that are accessible through a browser. And we said, that's the way people are accessing applications today. It'll be more so like that in the future. And so let's take this clientless first approach, because again, that's a very simplistic way to do it. We don't need to deploy new agents to end devices. It makes it very simple and seamless for third-party contractor access if you have a clientless first approach. And so being able to provide that access in a clientless fashion is really a main point of our solution called Menlo Private Access. Of course, if a client is needed, if there's SSH, RDP, or some other applications that have been developed internally that require an actual agent and then associated a client from us, we can give that. But we think that going forward, many applications will be browser-based. So lead with that clientless. It makes the IT team's job much easier. And beyond that, we also do some more stuff around the actual security of that connection. Oftentimes with some of the ZTNA solutions that are out there, they basically will establish that initial communication between user and application or the data. And then they step out of the way of that. They sort of let the application, the user access the application. We think that's not the right way to do it. We want to maintain zero trust across that entire framework, both from the user to the application and backwards from the application to the user. And so our isolation core allows us to do that. So we can do really cool things where we're always in that communication stream between the user and their application. And so we can do things like, maybe we want to make it a read-only application, right? So there's maybe a third party who only needs to view Confluence or something. So we can provide them that third party only read-only access to that application. Perhaps we don't want to let that user upload information, right? So we can prevent uploads for that user. And then we can also do stuff around the actual data access. So we can scan files for malicious traffic on the upload and download. We can do DLP checks in the information, right? So we can make sure that DLP type information isn't being accidentally shared in these applications. So we can do a lot of really strong security checks when that user is accessing the application, which makes our solution a pretty cool way to do this that's a bit differentiated in the market out there.
I would imagine the clientless is a favorable approach to many. Dan,
yeah, the less, that's the last thing, even if you have a client that replaces your VPN, you're just replacing one client for the other. So who wants to do that? I mean, let's remove a client from that end device and allow them to do their work. And again, it goes to that. It really makes it easy again for that IT team to get those third-party contractors, unmanaged devices up and running. There's no need to get an agent down there. Just spin them up with the clientless, and you'll have not only easy access, but again, that security tied to that.
By the way, we're not done yet. Don't be going away because we've got some Amazon gift cards to give away. Cody has the pleasure of doing that. Dan, do you want to kind of wrap things up for us? So kind of give us your thoughts, your parting thoughts, and on some of the data and also some of the commentary here during this webinar.
Yeah. So I mean, I think we've covered quite a bit, and also why companies are looking at different ways of providing remote access. So COVID was one thing, and maybe a bit of an inflection point on work from home and remote access, but this is the new normal. COVID, whether it goes or doesn't go, I mean, people want to work from anywhere, so providing us access to applications, I think, is critical, because no one wants to hear from a team, oh, we didn't get this project done on time because access was such a pain. So you need secure access with zero pain, I think, is why companies are looking towards ZTNA and other sort of new solutions beyond VPNs.
Great. I'll give you the last word, but then I'm going to steal it back, Eric.
Yeah, I mean, I think, like Dan mentioned, there's this new normal that organizations are going to have to look at as far as how do we provide access to applications and data to all the users who need access, not just your employees or anyone else. It's about providing that access to a wide gamut of people in a secure fashion. And so, it is a process. It's not going to be something that happens, like I said, in the next week, but it's something that a lot of organizations are thinking about doing today. And so having a plan in place is probably pretty important for you to think about.
Very good. Well, my last word is I just want to let folks know we have another Menlo webinar coming up on March 16th, 3 p.m., talking about solving the work anywhere and access everything security challenge. I think going into some more depth on this. Eric will be our featured speaker. So go to devops.com.
Unfortunately, there will be slides on that one. So.
Oh, you saved them for that one? Oh, I appreciate that. You're very kind. So I'm going to pop in the link in the chat. If folks want to go out and register, get that on your calendar now. Mine fills up fast. I'm sure yours does faster. One parting thought, though, I learned long ago that end users will always prioritize convenience over security, but they expect security.
Yeah.
Okay, back to you, Cody. Back to Cody in the booth there.
All right, thank you, Mitch. And I will just say that the link that you posted in the chat is now sticky at the top if anyone is interested. So I did just want to remind our audience today that the session was recorded. If you missed any of our discussion, then you will receive an email with a link to access the on-demand recording. Or in about a day, you can find it living on the DevOps website at devops.com/webinars. Quickly, we have 4 $25 Amazon gift card winners. They are Elena T, Lou T, Jan M, and Gabor L. So congratulations to the 4 of you. Keep an eye on your inbox to claim that gift card. And if you don't receive an email, just check your spam folder. So Eric, Dan, and Mitch, thanks so much for coming on here and sharing your expertise, for having a really in-depth conversation about a lot of things that I don't know a whole lot about. So I really appreciate you guys jumping in. I'd like to extend my gratitude to Menlo Security for sponsoring today's webinar. And my final thanks goes to you, our audience. We appreciate you being here with us today. Please take a moment to fill out our post-webinar survey, and we hope to see you at a future TechStrong Learning webinar. Have a great rest of your day, everyone.
Thank you.